The people who demand the most from you are sometimes the ones hiding the heaviest burdens. Ethan Brooks adjusted the cuffs of his crisp white shirt as he stood in the marble lobby of Sterling Global, watching the morning sunlight spill through 40-foot glass walls that reflected the skyline of Manhattan. The headquarters looked less like an office and more like a monument built for impossible expectations. Every employee moved with quiet purpose. Conversations were brief, footsteps were confident, and no one seemed willing to waste even a second. It was Ethan's first day as a strategy analyst, the opportunity he had worked toward since graduating from business school and spending years proving himself at smaller firms. Friends had congratulated him for joining one of the most influential companies in the country. They had also warned him about the man leading it. Adrian Sterling was known throughout the business world as a billionaire who expected perfection, challenged every assumption, and rarely offered praise. Stories about him traveled through boardrooms like modern legends. Some people admired his discipline. Others feared walking into meetings where every idea had to survive his relentless questions. Ethan reminded himself that rumors often became larger than reality. He took a slow breath, collected his presentation folder, and followed the executive assistant toward the top floor where the weekly leadership meeting was already beginning. The conference room overlooked the entire city, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that made the skyline feel almost close enough to touch. Senior executives quietly reviewed reports while large digital screens displayed financial forecasts and international expansion plans. Ethan suddenly became aware that he was the youngest person in the room by nearly a decade. Before he had time to settle into his seat, the doors opened once more. Adrian Sterling entered without announcing himself. The conversation stopped almost immediately, not because anyone had been instructed to remain silent, but because his presence naturally commanded attention. Tall, composed, and impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, Adrian carried himself with calm confidence rather than arrogance. His blue eyes moved across the room, noticing details that others overlooked. When they briefly met Ethan's gaze, there was no hostility, only careful observation. The meeting began without unnecessary introductions. Department leaders presented updates while Adrian listened quietly, occasionally asking precise questions that revealed weaknesses hidden beneath polished reports. Then Ethan's manager unexpectedly invited him to introduce a market analysis he had prepared before joining the company. Ethan stood, connected his presentation, and began explaining his recommendations with steady confidence. The first few minutes passed smoothly until Adrian calmly raised one hand. The room fell silent again. Adrian looked toward one chart before returning his attention to Ethan. "Your research is thorough," he said evenly, "but you built your conclusion on last quarter's customer behavior instead of the trend developing over the past 6 weeks. Tell me why you ignored the newer data." Ethan felt every pair of eyes turn toward him. He had reviewed months of information, yet Adrian had identified a detail no one else had mentioned. Ethan admitted honestly that he had prioritized historical consistency over emerging indicators. Adrian remained silent for a moment before replying. "Never defend yesterday when tomorrow is already giving you better answers." He closed the presentation and continued the meeting without raising his voice or embarrassing Ethan further. Yet the sentence echoed through Ethan's thoughts long after everyone returned to discussing budgets and acquisitions. Walking out of the conference room an hour later, Ethan wondered whether he had failed before his career had truly begun. What he did not realize was that Adrian had noticed something far more important than one imperfect chart. For the first time in years, someone had answered a difficult question with honesty instead of excuses, and that single moment quietly changed the way the billionaire CEO began looking at the newest employee in the company. The remainder of Ethan's first week unfolded nothing like he had imagined during the months leading to his new position. Instead of being quietly introduced to routine assignments, he found himself receiving increasingly complex analytical projects that normally belonged to employees with years of experience. Every morning, a neatly organized folder appeared on his desk with another challenge waiting inside. Market forecasts, acquisition strategies, international expansion reports, and competitive risk assessments demanded long hours and absolute precision. Several co-workers exchanged sympathetic looks whenever another assignment arrived. During lunch breaks, whispers drifted through the office cafeteria. Some believed Adrian Sterling deliberately overwhelmed promising employees to discover who could survive pressure. Others insisted no one remained on his executive strategy team for long because his expectations were impossible to satisfy. Ethan listened without joining the conversations. Complaining would not improve his work, and making excuses would only confirm every doubt people already had about a newcomer. Instead, he stayed later each evening, studying reports, reviewing industry data, and carefully refining every recommendation before submitting it. One afternoon, his manager unexpectedly appeared beside his desk with another confidential file. "The chief executive officer wants your analysis before tomorrow morning," she said calmly. Ethan glanced at the clock. It was already after 6 in the evening. The report covered an international partnership involving thousands of pages of financial projections and market research. Even experienced analysts usually requested several days for similar work. Ethan quietly accepted the folder, thanked her, and returned to reading. By the time most employees left the building, only a handful of lights remained across the enormous executive floor. The city skyline shimmered beyond the glass walls while silence settled over Sterling Global headquarters. Ethan removed his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, and continued working with complete concentration. Around 9 o'clock, he walked toward the break room to refill his coffee. As he returned, he noticed a conference room at the far end of the hallway still illuminated. Through the glass walls, he briefly saw Adrian standing alone before a massive digital display filled with financial charts. No assistants, no executives, no audience. The billionaire studied every figure himself, occasionally making handwritten notes across printed documents spread over the table. Ethan quickly looked away, not wanting to interrupt, yet the unexpected image remained in his thoughts. The stories surrounding Adrian had always focused on wealth, authority, and relentless standards. None of them mentioned that the man everyone feared appeared to work longer than anyone else in the company. Ethan returned to his desk and completed the assignment shortly after midnight. The following morning, he placed the finished report on his manager's desk before anyone else arrived. Hours later, an email appeared in his inbox with only one sentence. "Conference room 12. 10 minutes. The message carried Adrian Sterling's name beneath it. Ethan entered exactly on time, expecting another difficult critique. Adrian remained standing beside the window overlooking Manhattan, a printed copy of Ethan's report resting on the table. Without unnecessary introductions, Adrian looked toward him and asked, "How many assumptions in this report are conclusions you verified yourself?" Ethan answered honestly, "Every one of them." Adrian slowly nodded before turning another page. "Good. Most people repeat what they are given. You chose to challenge the numbers." He closed the report and met Ethan's eyes with the same calm expression as before. "Starting today, you will assist my executive strategy team on a confidential project. It will require longer hours, higher expectations, and complete discretion. If you are looking for an easy career, decline now." Ethan never hesitated. "I did not come here looking for easy." For the first time since joining Sterling Global, Adrian allowed the faintest trace of approval to appear across his face before quietly replying, "That is exactly why you are still here." The confidential project quickly became the center of Ethan's professional life. Every morning began before sunrise, and most evenings ended long after the city lights reflected across the glass towers surrounding Sterling Global. The executive strategy team occupied a private floor where conversations were measured, deadlines were relentless, and every recommendation carried consequences worth millions of dollars. Adrian rarely repeated instructions because he expected people to listen the first time. Surprisingly, Ethan discovered that the chief executive officer never asked anyone to do work he was unwilling to do himself. Long after department heads had returned home, Adrian remained in the office reviewing contracts, correcting projections, and studying international markets with unwavering concentration. One rainy evening, Ethan stayed later than usual to finish a revised presentation for an upcoming negotiation. Nearly every light on the executive floor had already been turned off except those surrounding the main conference suite. As he carried a stack of reports toward the printer, he noticed the door to the largest boardroom standing slightly open. Through the narrow opening, he caught sight of Adrian sitting alone at the far end of the conference table. The enormous digital display had gone dark, leaving only a single desk lamp illuminating hundreds of handwritten notes spread across polished wood. Beside the documents rested an old framed photograph of a much smaller office building with the words Sterling Global Headquarters written beneath it. Adrian studied the photograph quietly before placing it beside several faded architectural drawings that looked decades old. There was no audience, no executives to impress, and no carefully controlled expression. Instead, Ethan saw a man carrying responsibilities that appeared far heavier than the reputation surrounding his success. Without realizing it, Ethan paused for a moment too long. Adrian looked toward the doorway, and their eyes met. Ethan immediately apologized for interrupting and offered to leave. Adrian simply gestured toward the empty chair across the table. "Come in." Ethan stepped inside cautiously, placing his reports on the table. Adrian glanced toward the framed photograph before speaking. "This was our first office. My father started the company with fewer than 20 employees." Ethan looked carefully at the modest building, surprised by its simplicity. "It must be satisfying to see how far the company has come." Adrian smiled faintly, although there was more reflection than celebration in his expression. "Growth is rewarding. Responsibility is much heavier." He looked toward the skyline beyond the windows. "Every decision I make affects thousands of families. That reality never leaves when the workday ends." Ethan remained quiet because he sensed Adrian was not looking for reassurance. He was simply speaking honestly for perhaps the first time in weeks. After a brief silence, Adrian turned back to the reports Ethan had prepared. "You have been wondering why I keep assigning you difficult work." Ethan admitted the truth with a respectful nod. Adrian answered without hesitation. "Pressure reveals habits. Talent earns opportunities, but character determines whether someone can be trusted when the outcome matters." Ethan considered those words carefully before replying. "I thought you were trying to find my weaknesses." Adrian looked directly at him. "I already know your weaknesses. Every professional has them. I was looking for your integrity." The answer surprised Ethan more than any criticism ever could. As they reviewed the presentation together, Adrian challenged assumptions, refined strategies, and encouraged clearer reasoning without raising his voice once. Ethan gradually realized that the demanding standards everyone feared were never designed to humiliate people. They existed because Adrian refused to allow carelessness where thousands of livelihoods depended upon thoughtful leadership. Walking back to his desk later that night, Ethan no longer saw only the intimidating billionaire every employee whispered about. For the first time, he saw a leader whose greatest burden was not maintaining success, but carrying the weight of everyone who depended upon it. And that quiet discovery changed the way Ethan looked at every difficult conversation that followed. 2 weeks before the international negotiation, Sterling Global received unexpected news that immediately transformed the atmosphere across the executive floor. A competing corporation had entered discussions with the same overseas partners, threatening months of preparation and placing one of the company's most ambitious expansion projects at serious risk. Conference rooms filled from early morning until long after sunset as department leaders revised forecasts, legal teams reviewed contracts, and strategy specialists searched for solutions that could restore the company's advantage. Ethan quickly discovered that the confidential assignment he had joined was no longer an exercise designed to test his abilities. It had become the center of a decision capable of influencing thousands of employees, investors, and clients around the world. Adrian gathered the executive strategy team inside the largest boardroom and calmly outlined the new situation without exaggeration or unnecessary drama. He acknowledged every challenge openly before assigning responsibilities with remarkable clarity. Ethan received responsibility for analyzing competitive market behavior and preparing alternative negotiation scenarios before sunrise the following morning. Several senior executives exchanged uncertain glances, quietly questioning whether someone so new should handle work carrying such significance. Ethan noticed their hesitation but refused to let it distract him. Throughout the day, he examined financial reports, customer trends, international regulations, and historical partnership data until patterns gradually began revealing themselves. Late that evening, he walked into Adrian's office carrying a revised proposal that differed significantly from the company's original strategy. Ethan expected resistance because the recommendations challenged months of previous planning. Adrian accepted the documents without comment and spent nearly 30 minutes reading every page in complete silence. Finally, he looked up. Explain why you believe changing direction now creates less risk than continuing with the current plan. Ethan carefully described the emerging market indicators, the competitor's predictable negotiation style, and several overlooked opportunities hidden within recent consumer behavior. Adrian interrupted only to ask precise questions, each one forcing Ethan to defend his reasoning with evidence instead of confidence alone. By the end of the discussion, the office had grown completely quiet except for the distant sound of rain striking the windows. Adrian slowly closed the report and stood beside the city skyline. Most people become attached to their first solution, he said thoughtfully. You were willing to replace your own work the moment better evidence appeared. Ethan answered honestly. The goal is not to prove I was right. The goal is to help the company make the right decision. Adrian turned toward him with calm approval. That answer is rarer than you realize. The following morning, Adrian surprised the executive committee by replacing the original negotiation strategy with Ethan's revised recommendations. Several senior leaders immediately challenged the decision, arguing that trusting a newly hired analyst placed unnecessary risk on the company. Adrian listened respectfully before responding with complete confidence. The quality of an idea is never determined by the title printed on a business card. It is determined by the strength of the evidence supporting it. The room fell silent. Ethan felt both grateful and humbled, realizing Adrian had placed his own reputation behind a recommendation prepared by someone who had joined the company only weeks earlier. For the next several days, they worked side by side, refining presentations, anticipating difficult questions, and rehearsing every possible outcome. Long hours gradually replaced formal distance with professional trust. Ethan no longer saw only an intimidating billionaire leading a global corporation. He saw a leader who expected excellence because the people depending on his decisions deserved nothing less. Adrian likewise began seeing something different in Ethan. Beyond intelligence and determination, he recognized quiet courage, the willingness to speak honestly even when doing so carried personal risk, and that realization became the foundation for a partnership neither of them had anticipated when their paths first crossed inside the towering headquarters of Sterling Global. The international negotiations concluded with remarkable success, yet the celebration inside Sterling Global lasted only a single afternoon before new responsibilities quietly replaced congratulatory speeches. Financial news outlets praised the company's strategic direction, investors responded with renewed confidence, and employees across multiple offices finally allowed themselves to breathe after weeks of relentless preparation. Ethan expected the pace to slow, but Adrian seemed almost unchanged by the public recognition. The following evening, long after the final meetings had ended, Ethan remained in the executive lounge reviewing post-negotiation reports when he noticed Adrian standing alone beside the panoramic windows overlooking Manhattan. The city lights stretched endlessly beneath the night sky, reflecting against the glass as though the entire skyline had become another set of numbers waiting to be analyzed. Ethan approached carefully, carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee without saying a word. Adrian accepted one with a quiet nod before thanking him. For several moments, they simply stood together, allowing the silence to feel comfortable instead of awkward. Ethan finally spoke. Most people would probably be celebrating tonight. Adrian smiled faintly while looking toward the streets below. Celebrations are temporary. Responsibilities always return the next morning. Ethan studied the calm expression on Adrian's face before asking the question he had quietly carried for weeks. Do you ever allow yourself to enjoy what you have accomplished? Adrian remained silent long enough that Ethan wondered whether he had crossed a professional boundary. At last, Adrian answered with complete honesty. There was a time when I did. His voice remained steady, yet something softer appeared beneath every word. He explained that years earlier, shortly after taking over Sterling Global from his father, one ambitious expansion had failed because he ignored experienced advisors and allowed confidence to replace careful judgment. Although the company eventually recovered, hundreds of employees endured months of uncertainty that Adrian never forgot. Since then, he had promised himself never to confuse success with certainty again. Ethan listened without interrupting. Suddenly, the relentless standards, impossible deadlines, and constant questions no longer felt like signs of coldness. They were the habits of someone determined never to let overconfidence place other people's futures at risk. Ethan looked toward Adrian with genuine understanding. You have spent years protecting everyone else from mistakes that still weigh on you. Adrian quietly nodded. Leadership remembers consequences longer than victories. Ethan considered those words before replying with gentle sincerity. The people who work here trust you because you never stop caring about the outcome. Adrian looked genuinely surprised, as though compliments directed toward his character were far less familiar than praise for financial success. After another thoughtful silence, he said, "Most employees try to impress me. You keep trying to understand me instead." Ethan smiled modestly. Understanding people usually leads to better decisions than judging them. Adrian laughed softly, a rare sound that seemed almost unfamiliar inside the executive floor. Perhaps that is why your recommendations have become so valuable. Before leaving for the evening, Adrian invited Ethan to join him for dinner the following night after work. His invitation sounded completely natural, free from unnecessary formality or hidden expectations. "There is a small restaurant a few blocks from here," Adrian said. "The conversations are usually better there than inside conference rooms." Ethan accepted without hesitation. As he watched Adrian leave the office, he realized something important had quietly changed between them. The billionaire chief executive officer no longer seemed distant because of wealth or authority. He seemed human because he had finally allowed someone else to see the weight he carried every day, and Ethan understood that genuine trust rarely appeared through dramatic moments. More often, it arrived one honest conversation at a time, patiently transforming respect into something deeper that neither of them had expected to find inside the walls of Sterling Global. The restaurant Adrian had chosen sat quietly along a tree-lined street a few blocks from Sterling Global, far removed from the polished conference rooms and constant rhythm of executive meetings. Warm lights reflected against brick walls, soft jazz drifted through the dining room, and conversations remained low enough that neither man felt the need to compete with the noise around them. Ethan quickly realized that Adrian had selected the place not because it was fashionable, but because it allowed people to think without interruption. For the first several minutes, they spoke naturally about the negotiation, future projects, and the growing opportunities awaiting the company after its successful expansion. Without the formal setting of the office, however, the conversation gradually became less about quarterly reports and more about the people sitting across the table from one another. Adrian admitted that he rarely accepted dinner invitations because business meals almost always became another meeting in disguise. Ethan smiled and replied that this was the first business dinner he had attended where no presentation slides were waiting on a screen. Adrian laughed quietly, and the sound carried an ease Ethan had never witnessed inside Sterling Global headquarters. As the evening continued, Ethan spoke about growing up in a small Pennsylvania town where his parents owned a neighborhood bookstore that taught him the value of listening before speaking. Adrian listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions instead of steering the conversation back toward himself. In return, Adrian described how taking responsibility for Sterling Global at a relatively young age had gradually separated him from friendships that once felt permanent. Every decision eventually became connected to expectations, and every conversation seemed to carry an invisible agenda. Ethan considered those words before answering gently. "Perhaps that is why honesty feels so unusual to you now." Adrian looked at him with quiet curiosity. "You seem remarkably comfortable telling me uncomfortable truths." Ethan smiled modestly. "You hired me because I answered difficult questions honestly. I did not think that rules should change simply because we are having dinner." Adrian lowered his coffee cup and nodded with genuine appreciation. "Do not ever lose that habit." Several days later, back inside the office, Adrian surprised Ethan once again by inviting him to attend a private strategy session normally reserved for executive vice presidents and board advisors. The meeting involved planning the company's long-term innovation initiatives rather than solving immediate problems. As senior leaders debated ambitious proposals, Adrian repeatedly asked Ethan for his perspective, treating his ideas with the same respect given to executives who had worked beside him for decades. Ethan remained thoughtful, careful, and direct, never speaking simply to fill silence. After the meeting concluded, one longtime executive privately remarked that Adrian had never placed so much confidence in someone who had joined the company only months earlier. Ethan accepted the compliment with humility, understanding that trust had not appeared overnight. It had been built one conversation, one difficult assignment, and one honest decision at a time. Late that afternoon, Adrian stopped beside Ethan's desk before leaving for another investor meeting. "There is a leadership retreat next week," he said. "I would like you to come with the executive team." Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "I'm not sure I belong there." Adrian answered without hesitation. "You belong wherever your judgment adds value." Those simple words remained with Ethan long after Adrian disappeared into the elevator. They represented something greater than professional recognition. For the first time since arriving at Sterling Global, Ethan no longer felt like the newest employee trying to prove himself. He felt trusted by a leader who measured people not by titles or years of experience, but by integrity, courage, and the willingness to keep learning. Neither man spoke about what their growing connection might eventually become, yet both quietly recognized that the strongest partnerships rarely begin with certainty. They begin when two people decide that mutual respect is worth protecting, even before either of them understands where that path may ultimately lead. The executive leadership retreat took place at a quiet conference center overlooking the Hudson River, where Sterling Global gathered its senior decision-makers for 3 days of planning beyond quarterly reports and financial forecasts. Unlike the fast pace of headquarters, the retreat encouraged long conversations, careful reflection, and collaborative problem-solving. Ethan quickly realized that although the surroundings felt more relaxed, the discussions carried even greater importance because they would shape the company's direction for years to come. Adrian remained composed throughout every session, inviting disagreement whenever it was supported by thoughtful reasoning. Ethan admired how the billionaire never surrounded himself with people who simply agreed with every decision. Instead, he encouraged respectful challenges because stronger ideas emerged from honest conversations. On the second morning, however, the atmosphere changed unexpectedly. During a strategic review, one member of the executive board, Victor Langley, questioned the financial assumptions supporting a recently approved innovation initiative. Ethan immediately recognized the presentation because much of the supporting research had come from his own analysis. Victor calmly suggested that several market projections appeared overly optimistic and implied that an inexperienced analyst had influenced decisions carrying significant financial risk. Although Victor never mentioned Ethan by name at first, everyone in the room understood exactly who he meant. Several executives exchanged uncertain glances while silence settled across the conference table. Ethan carefully reviewed the documents in front of him, wondering whether he had overlooked something despite checking every calculation repeatedly. Victor continued speaking with measured confidence, explaining that relying on someone with limited corporate experience created unnecessary exposure for a company of Sterling Global's size. Ethan prepared himself to answer every question directly, accepting responsibility if genuine mistakes existed. Before he had the opportunity to speak, Adrian quietly closed the folder resting in front of him. The sound immediately drew every eye toward the head of the table. Adrian remained completely calm as he addressed the room. "The recommendation was approved because I evaluated every supporting document personally." His voice never rose, yet every word carried unmistakable authority. "If anyone wishes to question that decision, direct your questions to me." Victor politely responded that his concerns centered on the quality of the analysis rather than the approval process itself. Adrian nodded thoughtfully before sliding another report across the table. "Then let us examine the evidence instead of assumptions." For the next 20 minutes, Adrian methodically compared every forecast with independent industry research, demonstrating that Ethan's conclusions had anticipated several market shifts already beginning to appear. Each concern Victor presented received a detailed response supported by verified data rather than opinion. Eventually, the room became quiet once again. Adrian looked toward the board members before speaking one final time. "Experience deserves respect, but experience alone does not guarantee better judgment. Integrity, preparation, and intellectual honesty matter far more." He then turned toward Ethan for the first time since the discussion began. "Your work reflects those qualities. Continue trusting evidence even when it challenges established thinking." Ethan felt an unexpected mixture of gratitude and humility. Adrian had not defended him because of personal preference or misplaced loyalty. He had defended the truth because leadership demanded fairness regardless of hierarchy. Later that afternoon, Ethan found Adrian standing alone on the outdoor terrace overlooking the river. Ethan thanked him for his confidence, admitting that he had expected to defend himself during the meeting. Adrian offered a quiet smile. Leaders protect people who earn trust through character. Today, I was simply protecting the standard we expect from everyone. Ethan looked across the calm water reflecting the late afternoon sun and realized that respect had quietly grown into something far deeper. The billionaire who once seemed impossibly distant had become the first person to publicly believe in him, when doing so required personal responsibility, and that moment strengthened a bond neither title nor position could fully explain. Several weeks passed after the leadership retreat, and the atmosphere inside Sterling Global settled into a confident rhythm built on mutual trust rather than constant uncertainty. Ethan continued leading increasingly important strategic initiatives, while Adrian relied on his judgment with growing confidence. Their conversations remained professional during office hours, yet an unspoken understanding had quietly developed between them. They no longer needed lengthy explanations because each had learned how the other approached difficult decisions. One crisp Monday morning, however, everything changed with a single unexpected email. Ethan opened a message from one of the largest consulting firms in the country inviting him to discuss an executive position. The offer included a significant salary increase, immediate leadership responsibilities, and the opportunity to build an entirely new strategy division from the ground up. Friends outside Sterling Global congratulated him before he had even responded, insisting that opportunities like this rarely appeared twice. Ethan thanked them, but the decision felt far more complicated than anyone realized. The new position promised rapid advancement, yet leaving Sterling Global also meant walking away from the first leader who had ever challenged him without trying to change who he was. For several days, Ethan kept the offer private while carefully weighing every possibility. Eventually, Adrian noticed the unusual distraction in Ethan's normally focused work. Late one afternoon, he invited Ethan into his office after the final meeting had concluded. The skyline beyond the windows glowed beneath the fading colors of sunset, casting long reflections across the polished floor. Adrian studied Ethan for a quiet moment before asking, "Something has been occupying your thoughts all week. Would you like to tell me about it?" Ethan hesitated only briefly before placing the printed offer letter on the desk. Adrian read every page without interruption. When he finished, he carefully folded the document and returned it to Ethan. There was no visible disappointment, no attempt to question the opportunity, and no suggestion that Ethan owed the company anything because of the trust they had built together. Instead, Adrian leaned back calmly and said, "You have earned an opportunity that reflects your ability. I will never ask someone to ignore personal growth simply because it benefits my company." Ethan looked at him with genuine surprise. "You are not going to ask me to stay?" Adrian smiled softly. "If I convince you through pressure, you will eventually regret remaining. If you stay, it should be because your future genuinely belongs here." The honesty behind those words affected Ethan more deeply than any promise of promotion ever could. Adrian continued speaking with the same quiet sincerity that had gradually replaced the intimidating reputation Ethan once feared. Leadership is not measured by how many talented people you keep beside you. It is measured by whether they become stronger because they worked with you. Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, reflecting on every challenge Adrian had placed before him, every difficult question, every conversation that demanded honesty instead of comfort. He realized that the greatest lesson he had learned inside Sterling Global had nothing to do with finance, negotiations, or executive strategy. It was that genuine respect could never be demanded. It had to be earned through consistent character. As Ethan stood to leave the office, Adrian spoke one final sentence. "Take as much time as you need. Whatever decision you make, you will leave with my respect." Walking toward the elevator, Ethan held the offer letter in one hand while replaying Adrian's words in his mind. For the first time since receiving the invitation, he understood that the decision before him was no longer about salary, titles, or prestige. It had become a question of where he believed his purpose, his loyalty, and perhaps even his heart had quietly begun to find a home. 3 days later, Ethan requested a private meeting with Adrian before the executive board assembled for the morning strategy session. The first light of dawn stretched across Manhattan, painting the skyline with soft shades of gold and blue as Sterling Global slowly awakened for another demanding day. Ethan carried the offer letter inside a simple folder, but unlike the uncertainty he had felt only days earlier, his expression reflected quiet confidence. Adrian welcomed him into the office with the same calm professionalism that had defined every conversation between them from the beginning. Without unnecessary introductions, Ethan placed the folder on the desk. Adrian opened it, expecting another discussion about the competing company's proposal. Instead, he found a brief letter thanking the firm for its generous offer while respectfully declining the position. Adrian looked up, surprised but composed. "May I ask what changed your mind?" Ethan smiled gently. "Nothing changed. I simply understood my answer." Adrian remained silent, allowing Ethan to continue. "The other company offered me a better title and more money. Sterling Global gave me something much harder to find. It gave me a leader who expected honesty, challenged my thinking, trusted my judgment, and helped me become the professional I wanted to be. I realized I was never choosing between two jobs. I was choosing between two futures." Adrian lowered his eyes for a brief moment before quietly replying, "Thank you for making that decision freely." Later that afternoon, the executive board gathered to announce the company's next phase of long-term expansion. Senior leaders, department directors, and managers filled the conference room overlooking the city while employees watched through a live internal broadcast. Adrian concluded the presentation by introducing several organizational changes designed to support Sterling Global's continued growth. Before ending the meeting, he paused and looked toward Ethan. "Every successful organization depends upon people who are willing to challenge assumptions with integrity instead of protecting their own comfort," Adrian said. "Today, I would like to recognize someone whose character has strengthened this company as much as his work." Ethan looked genuinely surprised as Adrian invited him to stand beside the executive leadership team. Effective immediately, Ethan Brooks will serve as Director of Strategic Innovation, working directly with executive leadership to guide our future initiatives. The room responded with warm applause, not because of corporate tradition, but because many employees had watched Ethan earn every opportunity through humility, discipline, and consistent honesty. After the meeting ended and the building gradually returned to its familiar rhythm, Ethan found Adrian standing near the panoramic windows where so many important conversations had quietly unfolded over the past year. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence no longer carried uncertainty. It carried understanding. Adrian finally smiled and said, "When you first arrived, I believed I was hiring a talented analyst." Ethan answered with a quiet laugh. "And what do you believe now?" Adrian looked directly into his eyes. "I found someone whose integrity reminds me why leadership matters." Ethan nodded with sincere gratitude. "You taught me that excellence is never about demanding perfection. It is about helping people become better than they believed possible." Together, they watched the evening lights appear across the city that had witnessed every difficult question, every long night, and every small step that transformed professional respect into something much deeper. Their future would continue to bring demanding decisions, new challenges, and greater responsibilities, yet neither of them faced those moments alone anymore. The billionaire who once seemed unreachable had discovered that trust grows strongest when shared, and the young analyst who arrived hoping only to succeed had found a place where purpose mattered more than prestige. Inside Sterling Global, the work would continue tomorrow, but from that day forward, the strongest partnership in the company would never be measured by titles, wealth, or authority. It would be measured by two men who proved that genuine leadership begins with respect, grows through honesty, and quietly becomes the foundation for a future built together.